This video will be covering scapulohumeral rhythm as well as winging of the scapula. So the general idea with the scapulohumeral rhythm is you're just looking at the amount of range of motion that occurs at the shoulder joint in flexion or shoulder abduction. So remember, when we go, the general range of motion for both shoulder abduction and shoulder flexion is from 0 to 180 degrees. That's the full range of motion. So when we start talking about scapulohumeral rhythm, the idea is simply that a certain amount of that 180 degrees is going to come from the glenohumeral joint, and a certain amount of that motion is going to come from the scapulothoracic joint. And when those two work together, they're going to allow us to achieve a full range of motion of 180 degrees. So let me show you an image of this quickly. So this is that 180 degrees in shoulder abduction or shoulder flexion. So it's generally accepted in a typical concept that 120 degrees of that are going to come from this glenohumeral joint, so that humerus to the glenoid fossa, and the scapula, as it upwardly rotates, is going to contribute the last 60 degrees. So if we come back to this, I think that's essentially what's happening here, what they're kind of talking about here. So when you start looking at pathologies of the shoulder, especially pathologies that are constricting range of motion, you have to look very carefully and see if the restriction is occurring, for example, at the glenohumeral joint, or if it's occurring at the scapula, or maybe you have some restrictions occurring at the clavicle, because the clavicle is going to also contribute similarly to the scapula. So in this example here, you can read here, the humerus is not able to move through the normal range of motion, while the scapula is still able to move. So you can see in this individual, this person, and you can see how their body kind of tilts a little bit. This person is still achieving some shoulder range of motion, but it's strictly coming from that scapula upwardly rotating, while that glenohumeral joint is actually not achieving any motion. So here's an image here. I don't think you need to know these specific numbers, but just as you move on, this is something you can kind of remember. So in that first 30 degrees of shoulder abduction, the scapula is relatively stable. We call this the setting phase. So the scapula is not going to move, and the motion is going to simply occur at this glenohumeral joint. As we move through the next 90 degrees, or these 60 degrees of the humerus, you're going to have 2 degrees of motion at the glenohumeral joint for every 1 degree of scapula upward rotation. Okay, so you're 2 degrees here, 1 degree there. It's 2 to 1 as you move through these next 90 degrees. And then as you move through these last little bits, as we get towards the extreme ranges of motion up to that close to 180, so this is like 120, 150, 120 to 180 it would be, it becomes a 1-to-1 relationship, where for every 1 degree that your glenohumeral joint upwardly rotates, your scapula also moves that 1 degree. So when you add all these up, you should get to 180. So you go 30 and 30 is 60, 120, and then 30 and 30. So there's your 180. That kind of makes sense. So again, 30 degrees at this joint, 60 degrees here, and 30. So that should be 120, and then our last 60 degrees are going to come here at the scapula as you upwardly rotate that scapula, if that kind of makes sense. I went and found a video, so you can also see this a little bit. I'll slow this down so we can watch it a little more clearly, hopefully. So again, let me back up even just a little bit. And I'll try to pause it as we go through. So those first 30 degrees, you can notice that the scapula didn't move. All of the motion occurred here at the glenohumeral joint. So just that humerus moving. As you continue, you can see that scapula begin to move. And remember, the relationship through that range of motion we just saw is 2 degrees, 1 degree. So for every 2 degrees you move in this joint, that glenohumeral joint, you're going to move 1 degree at the scapulothoracic joint. And now we're up at 120 to 180, so we're at that extreme range of motion here. You'll notice that this scapula is going to move much more quickly. And then as you come back down, same thing. So hopefully this image also helps you see that scapulohumeral rhythm that we kind of have hopefully identified as we go through this. So that finishes up that scapulohumeral rhythm. I want to include in this video another idea just about, because it's a scapular concept, this idea of a winged scapula. So a lot of times a winged scapula is an observation you make as you go through your shoulder evaluation. So a lot of times what you're going to do is you're just going to look and you'll make a general observation, and you'll notice, man, that scapula is really sticking out. It can be bilateral. Oftentimes it is unilateral. So this winged scapula, it just means that that scapula has pushed away from the rib cage, and that generally is going to contribute to some general instability. So if you remember back to your anatomy, the muscle that is mainly responsible for inhibiting this winged scapula is going to be your serratus anterior, which attaches here at the medial border of your scapula. It wraps anterior to the infrascapular fossa, or the subscapular fossa, excuse me, and it's going to come and attach at your ribs on this anterior lateral side. So that muscle is the main one responsible for keeping this scapula down and tight. You can also imagine that that muscle is also going to be a direct contributor to our scapulohumeral rhythm. So as we move through this, we can see here it's going to be due to damage of the long thoracic nerve potentially, because that long thoracic is the nerve that innervates our serratus anterior. But it can also be due to weakness or fatigue of that serratus anterior, a lot of times from overuse. If you have someone that's going into a new profession or a new hobby or something, and they're doing a lot of overhead activities, and their serratus anterior is not ready to handle the load that is placed upon it, a lot of times you'll see some winging of the scapula. It can also just be due to overuse over time. So we'll keep going down here. Many different causes of winging of the scapula. You can see here serratus anterior, long thoracic nerve damage, and then that general instability that I was kind of talking about. Okay, so this is where we want to get to. So testing of that winged scapula. So as I mentioned, you can just make an observation a lot of times that that scapula will be winged. However, there's some tests that you guys can do, that we can do to assess for winging the scapula, because maybe during rest the scapula actually doesn't protrude, but as we go and do our activities, that is when the scapula protrudes. So some easy tests that you can look for are going to be, floor or wall push-ups. Essentially, you just choose a functional activity, and you're going to have the person do a functional activity, and you're going to watch that scapula and see what it does. See if they behave equally, bilaterally, etc. So a push-up is a really good one because your scapula needs to be pretty stable during that activity. If you have someone that's doing an overhead activity, you might watch the scapula while they're doing that. Maybe if they're hammering up high, or maybe they're painting a wall or whatever, you can watch them during that activity. And then treatments. So if it's a nerve problem, that's obviously not going to respond very well to our just straight strengthening of the serratus anterior. It may just take time, or it may take some neurological retraining. Either one. But if you feel like it's a muscular deficit, we can do some strengthening of the serratus anterior. And mainly what we're going to want to do to strengthen that serratus anterior is some scapular protraction. So not retraction, but protraction. Let's keep going down here. So these are some images of some progressive or extreme examples of winging of the scapula. But you can see how intense that this can get. Okay, and then I just wanted to finish with this. I went and found this video. This is one I used to watch with my high school kids. So this is an example of someone that has a really hypermobile scapula. You can see as he moves in, it contributes to some winging, but as he's in rest, he doesn't actually have specific winging of the scapula. So you can see he wings it. So he sticks it out, he crushes the can. So kind of crazy that he's going through. I think there's actually a Guinness Book of World Record for cans crushed between your scapulas in a certain amount of time. So kind of crazy, but anyway. And that finishes up this video of scapulohumeral rhythm as well as some winging scapula concepts.